competitions and they claim one breed is superior over another breed. Do you start to see the metaphor here? We start off with throwing together some ideas from XP, from Scrum, from DSDM, from other sources. Interestingly, in all male assembly, even though there were women programmers involved in the early stages before the event itself. And there's kind of like a story behind that. But what we then get is the development of lots and lots of different highly specialized species, yeah, all of which actually worry about very small things. Yeah. So my argument is kind of like we've got to think about, oh God, somebody's been playing with the transitions, apologies for that. If we want to rewild Agile, and that's a key concept in ecological management now, is to recreate wild spaces, create wild flower gardens, increase species diversity. Kind of like, this is a bit like climate change. It may these days be about mitigating the damage. I think if you look at Agile from a strategy perspective, you can see high levels of commodification. I remember when SAFe came out and over 3 years started to establish dominance, a lot of us did then and still oppose SAFe as the antithesis of Agile. Sorry about that. If anybody's offended, I don't apologize. Because that's what happens at the end of days. At the end of days, everything gets highly structured, highly consolidated. It's all about certificates. It's all about other things like that. And the species loses diversity. Yes. So what I want to talk about is kind of like elaborate on that a bit and then go through some of the changes I think we need. So a second metaphor for here, which is, I love this picture. I've got a copy of it on the wall somewhere. Agile, I think, has become a sheep in wolf's clothing. It's no longer fierce, all right? And there are several reasons for that. We got a few problems. First of all, there's the paradox of structure. I remember saying at Lean-Agile Scotland, it's a pity that XP didn't dominate the early days of Agile more than Scrum. At which point all the XP people got up and cheered, and I thought, I can't have this. And I said, but the problem is the XP people don't know how to talk with ordinary people, so nobody listened to them anyway. And they're still trying to work out whether that was an insult or not. Personally, it was meant to be a compliment. Right? The reality is the structure that Ken Schwaber put onto Scrum allowed Agile to scale. And this is a huge paradox with any new movement. If you don't have structure, if it doesn't have scale, if you have too much structure, then you start to lose the diversity, you get the domestication. And that's an issue and it's still there. Secondly, and this is the Agile disease, a certification scam. I've got 3 or 4 sets of letters I can put after my name. Firstly, I never bother. And secondly, they all came from 2 or 3 years of discipline study with a proper examination board. They didn't come from attending a 2-day course and then paying an annual fee to read slides to say I kept my ideas up to date. The idea that you can be a master of anything after a 2-day course followed by an open book exam, which you have to complete in your own time over the next X days, is just nonsense. Right? But actually, there's more money to be made these days out of certification schemes than there is out of producing good code, which makes a difference to companies. And Agile has got to break this. Yeah, I know it's difficult. I know you need those letters to get jobs these days. But we've got to break it because it's basically creating people without the right experience, without the knowledge. And it's also creating this rather perverse system where the only things that, like the only thing which makes things like SAFe work is when people don't follow the rules and just work around it and use it as a camouflage for what they were going to do anyway. I mean, the other success of SAFe, by the way, we're on the subject, was it made it so expensive to adopt that nobody could admit it hadn't gone right. It hadn't gone right. And that's an old trick as well. Another key metaphor, there are too many recipe book users in Agile and not enough chefs. Now this difference is important. When I first went up to university, I was given a recipe book by my grandmother. She also tortured me in the 6th form because I entered cookery competitions. In Wales, we have this annual thing called the Eisteddfod, and there are competitions in every subject in school. She actually made me put my hands in bags of ice for 20 minutes before I was allowed to roll the pastry. So I had a sort of apprenticeship, but I needed a recipe book to take things forward. These days, I haven't got one recipe book anymore. I've probably got about 50. I don't think I've ever followed them in the last 40 years. They're sources of ideas, they're not prescriptions. And one of the reasons for that is that, kind of like now I can understand the principles of cookery. Sorry, Amazon deliveries coming in background. I understand the principles of cookery. I understand the principles of taste. I've got recipes I can draw on, but I'm adapting to it. So if you bring a recipe book user into your house to produce a meal for you, they'll produce a perfectly good meal as long as you have all the right equipment and all the right ingredients. But if anything goes wrong, they're lost. Whereas the chef will make a brilliant meal with whatever you happen to have lying around. And that's a mixture of training and also experience. It's what Aristotle called phronesis and sophia, practical wisdom acquired over time through practice, through doing things with your hands, and sophia, theoretical knowledge. Yeah, you need both. In fact, Agile tends to misuse the word empiricism. And what it ends up meaning is whatever I did last time must be universal. I'll do it again and grant you a certificate in it. We talk about what's called theory-informed practice. If you don't understand why something worked, you shouldn't try and scale it. Just because it worked for you last time doesn't mean it will work for you again. Next, we have what I call the Spotify error. If anybody else says we're adopting a Spotify model, there's kind of, another Scandinavian dies. It's like the fairies in Peter Pan, right? As everybody has been saying in Spotify for years, there isn't a bloody Spotify model. It's just the journey we live through. And this is a problem. People see something which is desirable and they want to do the same thing. What they forget is that thing is only possible in that organization because of the journey they lived. So you can start a journey in a similar place, but you shouldn't start at the end point. We then get a massive problem. This is, by the way, generally a problem in management literature and also, I'm sorry, in social science. My background is in physics and philosophy. From a physicist's point of view, no social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion. And from a philosopher's point of view, social scientists are people who didn't have the intellectual rigor to take philosophy. That's a little bit more pejorative. Right? But what you see in social science is somebody goes and studies 50 or 60 companies which have a quality they like in common, like high profit for the last 20 years. And then they identify things that they have in common. They do all the mathematics. They produce a correlation and causation equation. Good to Great by Jim Collins is a good example of that, partly because all of the companies he said were going to be great have now all failed with one exception. Because the context has shifted. If any country on this world wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins every year, well, first of all, it has to have some respect for science. So I'm now going to exclude some participants here. Right? But actually, if you increase the amount of dark chocolate consumption, that's the way to do it. Because if you didn't know it, dark chocolate consumption directly correlates per head of population with Nobel Prizes per head of population for the last 2 decades. And that's a much bigger sample size than most management consultants ever use when they draw their own conclusions. The other one I love on this, by the way, is that drownings by suicide directly correlate with the release of Nicolas Cage movies. But I can actually see a reason for that one. Right? And then we get what I call a Lecroux error. This is where somebody has a quasi-religious theory and they only go and find aspects of cases which support that theory. And they ignore the things which defy it. And there's a lot of books like that. It's like people trying to claim that Steve Jobs was an agile leader. I mean, I had a pile of books thrown at me by Steve Jobs once. I'm quite proud of that. It's one of my claims to fame, right? When he was working with Next, right? This attempt to constantly fit everything which people think was good into whatever is the current fad is actually very dangerous. It's bad science and bad process. It's bad for Agile, by the way, as well. So the sort of thing we do is to use natural science as a constraint. Yeah. So natural science gives us something which is subject to repeatable experiments. Yeah. Therefore, we can rely on it. And it's quite interesting. I've finally finished the European Union handbook on how to manage in a crisis using Cynefin, joint production between the Cynefin Centre and the Design Centre at the European Union, which is somewhat ironic given my own country's stupidity in leaving, but I'm trying to find Irish ancestors at the moment. Right? But one of the things we're saying in that is that during conditions of extreme uncertainty, you can't use past experience as a guideline because everything is changing. But you do know there are things we know for certain about human cognition, about systems, so we can follow from that. So let's run through a few of those. This is one I've used at a lot of Agile conferences, and it never loses its value. It's something called inattentional blindness. So you take a group of radiologists and you give them a batch of X-rays and you ask them to look for anomalies. On the final X-ray, you put in plain sight a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of the average cancer nodule. And on average, 83% of radiologists don't see it. Even more scarily, the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. So this is called inattentional blindness. We do not see what we do not expect to see. With that one little scientific fact, I've invalidated virtually every systems analysis process run within software development. Yeah, we do not see what we do not expect to see. We make decisions by scanning about 3 or 4% of the available information and doing a first fit pattern match with our previous experience. Now, part of what's called naturalizing sense making, the approach I developed, is that you have to recognize this. And you have to start to develop processes which recognize what are called biases. Interestingly, Gary Klein, myself, and others don't call them cognitive biases anymore. We call them cognitive heuristics. Because overall, from a species point of view, the so-called biases are really good at energy efficiency. Yeah, so we should recognize these aren't things which are wrong about us, they're things which are right about us, and we have to work around it. So some of our work, which I haven't got time to go into today, is to work on mapping unarticulated needs. Because if you can match existing capability against unarticulated needs, you can get major competitive advantage. But that's done by multiple human agents, not a single or a small group of analysts from a specific background. We've also done things like trios, which is putting together an experienced, say, systems tester or architect together with a bright young programmer. So old and young, yet technically experienced, technically inexperienced. So you get that transgenerational ideas together with a user trained to talk to IT people. And just to make it clear, it's very easy to train users to talk to IT people. It's a lot harder to train IT people to understand users. Yeah. So basically we have a trio, user, 2 types of IT people. We throw 20 trios at a problem for a week and see what they come up with. Now that basically means 17 to 20% of the trios will come up with something the others haven't seen, but now we can pay attention to it. And I can give you other examples of that later, but that's one fairly simple technique. So we need the multiple sensors. These are kind of like implications on this, right? If we don't see what we don't expect to see, we've got to start to actually build systems which have multiple sensors from multiple perspectives. And a lot of our work, and this actually came from our work on DARPA before and after 9/11. I was on weak signal detection, and when I spent most of my time in Washington, DC, that is. You've got to find ways in which the 17% become visible and people will pay attention to them. And there's a body of work on that. Secondly, hindsight isn't the same thing as foresight. This is one of the key lessons from complexity theory. Yeah, the fact it happened that way last time doesn't mean it will happen that way again in the future. The fact that the last 3 projects you did, or in Dean's case, the last 3, your memories of part of the last 3 projects you did, does not mean you can create a generic rule or a generic principle, because the way you remember it is problematic. and also the context is changing rapidly around you. Key thing here is ritual, not rules, or heuristics, not rules. Yeah? I'm doing a big project at the moment, and this is with civil emergency, civil contingency guys, where we're creating this dividing line between rules, which apply where we can predict the future, and heuristics, which apply where we can't predict the future. Right? So, for example, the US Marines have 3. If the battlefield plan breaks down, capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. Now, those aren't fancy platitudes or principles, they're hard, measurable heuristics, but they provide guidance for decision-making uncertainty. We normally derive those from direct observation. And then a framework I developed some time ago, which is called See, Attend, Act, which says, do I see the data? Do I pay attention to the data? Will I act on what I see? Are 3 completely separate processes. Most IT systems assume that if you present the right information to the right people at the right time and they have the right training and the right competencies, they will make the right decision, and that's complete nonsense. Whether they see something or not is a question in the first place. Whether they pay attention to it, if they see it, is another one. And whether they can politically act on it is another one again. I could tell you some stories about that from US politics, but in the interest of time, I won't. Second principle, assuming many of you have got children, and you're probably doing a lot more homeschooling than you intended to at the moment, right? When they're young, you tell them stories. So just checking here, does anybody tell the story about how Dick and Jane stayed at home, did what mummy and daddy said, achieved the family KPIs and got the certificate in being a good child, right? I satirized this in Dallas once and discovered there's a whole industry in Dallas which actually does produce KPIs for families, which deeply worried me, right? And I like Dallas, it's one of my favorite cities, but never mind. Basically, the stories we tell about how Dick and Jane went into the wild wood against mummy's and daddy's advice, met witches and warlocks and other strange beasts. We tend to make sure it has a happy ending. Grimm's fairy tales don't. What Disney did to Grimm is appalling. But generally, fairy stories have a happy ending because we want them to sleep at night. But we teach through failure, not through success. Yeah, it's interesting. We've done a huge amount of work on safety around the world. And the stories that people tell aren't the stories about how somebody clipped their belt to the harness and therefore didn't fall off the gantry. The stories that everybody spreads and learn about the guy who didn't clip on, fell off and was lucky because he fell on one of his mates and broke his mate's leg, but he lived. Everybody can tell you that story. Yeah, stories of failure have more teaching value than stories of success. One of the ways that we do corporate mission statements, is actually to agree what we don't want to be, rather than trying to force people into agreeing what you do want to be. The whole mission goals thing is just an excuse to develop platitudes on flip charts and actually encourage corporate gamers. The minute you actually announce your values, this is 101 anthropology, you just lost them. Because now everybody knows what language to use to get your attention as a leader. Yeah, in anthropology, real values are unstated but understood. They're not articulated. The process of articulation destroys them. So, some implications for this. First of all, avoidance of failure is actually a better strategy. We build worst practice systems for people, not best practice systems. People pay more attention to them, they learn from them. One of the reasons for that is failure repeats, but success rarely does. The other thing is cognitively, human beings pay more attention to failure than they do to success. It registers faster. Yeah, because in evolutionary terms, it's more useful. So worst practice, not best practice systems. Abstraction is key. Now, again, I apologize here if anybody's offended by this. So if there are any young earth creationists around, you may not like this, but again, I have no intention of apologizing. I'm still deeply distressed by a knowledge management conference I was at, where I discovered 2/3 of the chief knowledge officers of US departments were actually creationists. That really worries me. And I'm a Catholic, all right? So I'm allowed to say some of this. Basically, if you look at evolutionary history, art comes before language in human evolution. Cave paintings and music come first. Now, it's probably an accident, like most things in evolution. We now know evolution wasn't survival of the fittest, it was survival of the most opportune, which is a very different proposition. But basically, art developed because abstraction is key to innovation. What art does is it allows you to move from the concrete to the abstract, and then you make novel connections. Right? Which actually means the focus on STEM education in schools at the moment is actually quite dangerous, because it will force people into only thinking in the concrete, and we'll lose that general ability. Yeah. Some of the stuff we do with SenseMaker is actually to deliberately force people into abstraction on interpretation, so that they can't actually game the system or understand what's concrete. And then there are things like failure games. I grew up doing my homework to Star Trek, the first ever edition of Star Trek. Yeah? It was very good for doing maths homework too. So you can see where this came from. We actually run simulation games. In whatever people do, they're doomed to fail. So they go through 3 rounds of failure. Yeah, this is generally led by a human team, which is malicious. Yeah, at the end of 3 rounds of failure, they are physically scanning 20 to 30 times more data than if they go through a game where they succeed. Yeah, so teaching people in failure is more successful than teaching people in success. And then we get on to complexity science. Key thing to understand about the complex adaptive system is that everything is entangled. There's a metaphor for this, which Alicia Geraro came up with, and Kurtz and I wrote an article with the title. She said, a complex system is like bramble bushes in a thicket. Yeah, now, I go walking in the Welsh Hills, all right? We're finally allowed to do that again. And I go walking with 3 doctors, which, by the way, is very dangerous. My wife said, I'm glad you're going walking with 3 doctors. That means you'll be safe. And I said, 1 doctor, yes, 3 doctors, no, because they'll spend all their time arguing about what's wrong with you. When they die, they'll argue about who's responsible. They never agree on anything medical. Yeah? But one of them is fascinated by old buildings, you know, wrecked stone buildings, old farmhouses in Welsh valleys. So there's now a scary phrase within our group where Paul will suddenly say, let's turn right through the heather, at which point we all panic. Because we now know we're going to be led into this sort of deep thickets through ferns, bramble bushes, you know, and he'll be sat there saying there should be a path here somewhere when we're sort of, you know, our clothes have been ripped by the brambles, etc. Sorry, you may not want this level of personal detail, but the point is everything is entangled with everything else. You know they're separate plants, but you can't separate them. You can't decompose a complex system to its separate parts without destroying it. And complex systems also have a history. Yeah, and you can't deny that history. You can't start from scratch. One of the metaphors I use frequently for organizational development is you never get a greenfield site in organizational change. You're always working on a brownfield site. So you don't start from scratch. Everything has a history. So deeply entangled systems, and this is critical, don't have causality. Yeah, there is no linear causality. The same thing won't happen again the same way twice, except by accident. But you can manage complex adaptive systems through managing the constraints. And there's a key difference here between a governing constraint, that's like a rule, and an enabling constraint, which is like a heuristic. So basically, an enabling constraint allows you to give some sort of structure to the system, but not too much. We also talk about exto and endoskeletons, an external skeleton or an internal skeleton. Yeah, and again, I haven't got time to go into this, but one of the things we've been developing for the past 3 years with RAND Corporation, MIT, and others is a whole typology of scaffolding, i.e., what structure can you put in place around things which can grow and emerge? If you know the way they farm mussels, they throw old ropes into the sea and the mussels affix them and grow around them. Yeah, one of the ways we're now starting to look at software development is you first of all pick the type of scaffolding you want, which isn't necessarily highly structured, And then you define the interactions between people and software around that scaffolding, and you allow applications to emerge. In a complex adaptive system, the most critical thing is how things connect, not what they are. And by the way, that has major implications for organizational design. Trying to change people is not ethical and won't work. Changing how people connect changes systems a lot faster. So, run through the implications. We've got the hindsight issue again. There's a question, yes, what key thing in complexity called retrospective coherence. When you look backwards, everybody can see the connection between cause and effect, but they didn't see it at the time. Yeah, there's a body of stuff going to that, but retrospective coherence is a really big danger, the dangers of hindsight. Secondly, because there are no linear relationships between cause and effect, what matters is you measure the dispositions of the system. So we do that with what are called fitness landscapes, which look like contour maps. If you've ever walked or hiked, yeah, you know the contour map tells you the dispositions of the land, so you know where it will be easy to walk and where it will be difficult to walk. Yeah, even in a mist, you get that sort of direction. So that's dispositionality, and that's a different way of thinking. Yeah. And interaction is more critical, and I've given you the example of trios there. I've given you that one as well. So I'm not going to draw Cynefin now, all right? There's more than enough articles on this. And that, if you don't know, it is the top of Glydderfach within North Wales. Right? Cynefin is a sense-making framework. One of the things it's fundamentally based on is the belief that different things work in different domains. So my argument for a long time has been that Scrum is a really effective technique in what's called the liminal domain of complexity in Cynefin. That's the space between complex and complicated. So it's in the complex domain, but we know enough that we can start to structure things. Yeah? So that the great strength of Scrum is its ability to take something with a high level of ambiguity and get it structured in very quickly in short cycles so that it actually is scaled. It makes the complex complicated. Yeah? But it's not the only technique. There's nothing wrong with time boxes. We use time boxes a lot when I was programming. Yeah, we are always going to deliver on this date. Yeah, we may vary the resources or we may vary the delivery, but we'll always deliver on this date. That's a good technique, and you can have 3 months time boxes. There's nothing wrong with waterfall. And I remember working with Telstra, and a lot of infrastructure projects are waterfall. They're not agile. As Martin and others have said, Agile is really good at short cycle delivery with high customer interaction. It's really poor at infrastructure. But because the only way you got promoted in Telstra was to be Agile, they invented 1-year sprints. So they could do the waterfall projects and call them Agile. I thought that was quite clever, really, right, in terms of the gaming behavior. Right? So the point about Cynefin is a multi-method approach. It's not an attempt, like things like SAFe, to put everything into one huge, great engineering diagram. It's actually an attempt to say different things work in different spaces, and you need to work over the handover mechanisms. Yeah, so this method will work here, that method will work here. There isn't a single method which works everywhere. And there's kind of like an underlying metaphor for here. This is a gaping void cartoon. We do a lot of work with them. And sorry about the him on this. I'm trying to get a corrected version. If you want a carpenter to do his best work, let him use his own tools. We don't all drive to work in the same cars, or we don't all work at home in the same environments. We like to personalize things. There are different tools and techniques. I have a personal view that anybody who doesn't use styles in word processing documents and PowerPoint should be taken out and garroted publicly as an example to other people. Because I'm the poor bloody side that has to integrate the documents, all right? People who put 2 carriage returns at the end of a paragraph are in this category. But there are different styles and different approaches. You can't force people into one particular structure. So this ability to not only define different tools, but allow people to use tools which work for them is one of the ways that Agile has got to go. We've got to get more diversity into Agile. Things like SAFe are trying to reduce diversity just when we need to increase it. And there are 3 fundamental principles of complex systems design. And I'll go through these and then I sort of more or less finished, right? And that's a picture I took of the sea in Anglesey. You know, it's deliberately designed with the light. You know, this is high levels of uncertainty. So, oh, sorry. Every now and then my daughter, who is now 31 and should stop this and is a senior anthropologist and works for me, she gets onto my screens and she changes the fades, right? So I apologize for that. Optimize the granularity. What you deal with matters. If it's too big, it can't change. If it's too small, you can't manage it. It's kind of like an optimal level of granularity. So one of the things you notice is social media works far better than papers because it's small fragments of information that people can assimilate in large numbers. The famous Dunbar sequence of 5, 15, 50, 150, although it's much overused in Agile, small units can combine and recombine, large units can't. So if you get, generally this is about reducing the granularity, not increasing it. If you reduce the granularity, you've got more dynamics in the system, you can manage better. These are principles of facilitation. Secondly, distribute and diversify the cognitive function, the situational assessment. Remember the 17% and the 83%? You want lots of people from lots of different backgrounds interpreting the situation at the same time, so you can find the people who are thinking differently. Yeah? You may still centralize decision-making, but you're diversifying and distributing the cognitive function. And thirdly, disintermediate the decision makers. Decision makers need to have direct access to raw data. At a political level, some of the work we've done is to make ordinary people's stories visible to politicians without interpretation. That's where we use children and ethnographers to gather stories and then presented them within the fitness landscapes. What we're doing on unarticulated needs is to make user experiences directly visible to coders without anybody interpreting those into story points or anything else. Because there are things in that material you need access to. So disintermediation is a key principle. The minute somebody summarizes, they lose things in the process of summarization, and those things may actually be very important to you. So those are the three basic principles. And then granularity matters. You don't scale a complex system by aggregation or imitation, but you scale it by decomposition and recombination. This is probably one of the most important slides. And actually with this, I'm going to almost finish, right? If you think about it, the whole of organic life form is actually different combinations of 4 chemicals in DNA. The way you scale in a complex system is you decompose to a minimal viable unit, then you allow recombination so a new system emerges. Yeah? What you don't do is imitate something which is old or just replicate it in terms of the way it works. That's the key principle. Scaffolding I've talked about. Yeah, sorry, ignore this, but I haven't got time to go through it. And ignore that. This is where I want to finish, all right? Remember I started off with dogs and I made the sort of slightly point about cat owners. This is from Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. If you haven't read them, they're wonderful for children. Yeah. How the elephant got his trunk on the great grey greasy Limpopo River is something I still know by heart. Yeah, how the leopard got its spots and how the first alphabet was made. They're just beautiful little allegorical stories, and they use English beautifully because it's that period. That early 20th century English is almost as good as Elizabethan English. And one of my favorite stories is the story of the cat. So the woman, it's the woman in the cave who does this with the man as an overseer, domesticates the dog, domesticates the horse, and domesticates the cow by doing them a deal. Milk, riding, hunting in return for food and shelter. The cat wants the food and shelter, but it doesn't want the domestication, thank you very much. So it tricks the human beings into providing it. Yeah, and as he goes away, he says, I am the cat who walks by himself and all places are alike unto me. Yeah, he can live in domestication, but he also lives in the wild. We need that combination of both. For Agile to survive, it's got to increase what I call requisite diversity. It's got to rediscover some of the excitement of its foundation 20 years ago. And with that, I'll finish, and that's left 10 minutes for questions or arguments or anything.
All right, thank you, Dave. Does anybody have any questions?
David, hi, it's Matthew calling, also from the UK. Thanks very much. That was really, really good. I have a whole flurry of questions, but just in the interest of time, how do organizations go about thinking more in the Cynefin framework? And as they go on those journeys, what sort of levels of success have you seen and times to get to a point where you'd sort of say, yes, that's successful?
If you're starting journeys, you never get to that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
We're actually organizing 21 days of Cynefin stories in October, which we'll announce next week. Yeah. Where people will tell their own stories about that. I'm just giving an illustration. Cynefin is taught at command level for the US Marines, the US Army, the US Navy, and the US Air Force. So you don't get beyond the sort of level of colonel without understanding Cynefin. Right? Because fundamentally, you have to understand the difference between complex and complicated, right? In that sort of sense. I've seen it in projects that we're running, for example, on old people's homes, where the complex interactions of relatives with medical needs with COVID is beyond traditional best practice to apply. And we can see that working at the moment within the Netherlands and so on. But Cynefin is really a sense-making framework. It's a way of allowing people to have a different conversation, yeah, in that sort of sense. So I can give you more examples, but there's a whole bunch published. There's a lot of software examples. People like Liz Keir, for example, has recorded videos. There's the Codevin guy and other people. Yeah. But generally, we come in on intractable problems. It's interesting. We expect with the EU Handbook on Crisis Management coming out next month, that's going to generate a lot of need as well. And we're starting to see people shifting towards complex systems approaches to strategy, kind of like the post-Porter stuff. And I'm having conversations with some of the big consultancies around that. This is actually apex predator theory. Radical new ideas come in when the old system is tired, not when the old system is active.
No, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. I've just finished, spent 17 and a half years in the what's trendily called now data science, but I was the guy that built the data warehouses and then did a master's in cybersecurity. So
I built the Channel 4 one. I still remember designing that.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, this, I
sort of arguments about Sybase and Infomix.
Well, yeah, and it's, yeah, the changes in the data world are good, but I still have regular arguments with a lot of the scene engineers saying, what's the relationship between a data lake and a data warehouse? Because you still have need for a BART, but you lot seem to think the lake rules the world. But yeah.
We talk about, I mean, there's a traditional divide between big data and thick data. We talk about rich data. So you need human interpretation on raw data. You can't just do black box stuff. And I have a background in AI and things like submarine recognition. Like one of the key things that we've actually been developing with SenseMaker is the means to generate training data sets. Because the problem with big data and AI is people focus on the algorithms, they don't focus on the training data sets, and that's what matters. Any more?
Give some examples of everything you've talked about in your real world day-to-day life, like how you've used that kind of information and process.
Sorry, could you say that again? You cut in and out.
Yeah, I was saying, can you maybe give some personal examples of how you use this process in your life or at work or?
Okay. Oh, just trying to think of it. Well, I remember sitting down in Washington before 9/11 with a former national security advisor in drawing Cynefin. And he looked at it and he said, that explains 50 years of failure in American foreign policy. You know, we treated complex as if it was complicated. You know? And from that, both with US government and Singapore government, you know, I remember in the series of workshops. And one of the things we did in Singapore is we realized that the water policy with Malaysia was a complex problem, not a complicated problem. So they stopped trying to solve it with traditional methods and instead ran out 5 or 6 PR probes to see how the Malaysians responded. And that transformed the way they thought about the problem. So that's kind of like a big picture policy issue. Yeah. A police SWAT team commander in Florida actually drew it by hand with a rusty nail on the back of a breeze block and had a conversation with the SWAT team. And they agreed that the problem was complex, not complicated. So they did probes and didn't follow standard operating procedures. But critically on that, when they phoned up headquarters and said it's complex, we're probing, nobody challenged it because they were using Cynefin at a strategy level as well as an operational level. So those would be 2 examples, you know, which immediately come to mind.
Dave, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to refer back to one of your slides where you said that abstraction is the key to learning and invention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about like people who do try to model a business architecture and they think about creating these value chains and things like that, the premise behind that is that there's always causality when we're trying to create a link of chains. But what you said is that this is not the, you didn't say it's not the right way, but you said like you must try to understand the systems first, whether you're in a complex domain or a complicated domain, before you actually try to create these kind of value chain. So if that's the case at architecture level where you're trying to understand the strategy and the business, how it's creating value, is there no way to create that kind of abstraction?
That's actually where I mean, say this is the work we've been doing on a complex systems alternative to design thinking. Because the double diamond of design thinking has become highly linear, highly structured, and highly commodified. They're even granting certificates by post now. So the scaffolding concept, let me give some examples. So scaffolding can be something like the bamboo scaffolding they throw up in the Middle East, or steel scaffolding. There are differences, but that's an external one. It can also be mitochondrial, i.e. it's where you start to lay a nutrient lattice over a burn so that the lattice dissolves into the skin, but it gives structure for the thing to regrow. Yeah. Informal networks in organizations are rather like the fungus, which actually enable root systems of plants to draw oxygen and nutrients from the soil, and they're much neglected in design. So, and there's also a wonderful little lattice you can put on a heart, and it dissolves into the heart, but leaves electrical circuits in the right place. So we've been gradually developing a typology of scaffolding. So the way we see systems architecture developing, and I'm about to start a series of seminars within COSI in the UK on this to look at the implications of this for software engineering, is you first of all look at the level of uncertainty, and from that you choose an appropriate type of scaffolding. And then you define the interactions, and this is kind of like object orientation or microservices. Yeah, but you focus on, and I remember arguing this on Corba committees back in the 80s and 90s. And I said, people and organizations are objects too, not just software. So you define the interactions between people and software within the scaffolding. Then you see what emerges from that. Yeah. So scaffolding becomes a type of abstraction. Yeah. It's also key to what we call exaptive learning. So exaptation is the biological process by which something which evolved for one purpose under conditions of stress repurposes for something completely different. A technology example would be a guy noticed that a chocolate bar melted in his pocket. He realized the significance. We got microwave ovens from the magneto of a radar machine. So one of the ways we use abstraction is to associate existing capabilities with unarticulated needs and present ideas to people around which they might develop solutions. So that would be another example of the use of abstraction.
Thank you.
I have a question. You mentioned that worst practice beats best practice. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's I mean, we've done a lot of work on this over the years, all right? The stories that spread naturally around the water coolers aren't stories of success, they're stories of failure. All human stories evolve to tell stories of failure, not success, and that includes Aboriginal stories, which are a very different form from either Arabic or Western stories, which are the two other dominant forms. And the reason is that avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy, yeah, than imitation of success. So let me take some examples on that. So if I create a database of near fatal failures in a health and safety environment, I actually make the organization safer because I tell people what to avoid rather than giving them an idealized model of how they should behave. Yeah, so that's kind of like one example. I mean, and I've been, you know, a mountain leader off and on most of my life on mountain rescue. If you haven't lived through a whole bunch of failures, you don't know what the hell you're doing, right? If you never fail, you never actually really learn, and you can't teach other people. So the safety example is a common one. Some of the work we're now doing with organizational design is not to create a sort of common set of values and beliefs and a statement of what we should be, which is difficult to get agreement to, except by rendering it more or less meaningless and is heavily gained. But we reach agreement on the set of stories we don't want to be, which is very easy. And then we can reference those, and it leaves open possibilities which can be explored. So there's a lot of use of negative stories. I mean, they're a historical aspect of human life anyway. And one of the things I often ask people when they challenge me on this is, what stories are told in your organization? Yeah, stories of failure or success. I mean, the reality is we spread stories of failure. It's negative on the internet. But overall, it has better evolutionary advantage.
Doesn't that invite an attitude that breeds risk avoidance?
Actually, no, it doesn't, because if you have the key thing is the granularity point again. If you have lots of micro stories of failure, you won't go down that route. Yeah, but it leaves open different possibilities, so it makes risk easier. The problem with highly structured targets and highly structured goals is nobody will risk not achieving them. Yeah, so allowing some diversity on that is actually better for risk adoption. Any more?
I got a question about concept of scaffolding, the scaffolding and the alignment of teams within that scaffolding. Is that sort of like implying like Conway's laws? Like you basically set up structure and then the system.
I've got to write a blog on this. I actually don't think Conway's law is true. Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily so. So I don't think, I think it is possible to design different types of system. And my original work on Cynefin, I've been going back to it lately because I've had to write this article, which was meant to be 3,000 words. The origins of Cynefin were work I did when I was working in IBM on the balance between informal and formal communities. And what we found was the ratio was 60-1. And that was just virtual communities. So there were 60 informal communities to every formal community. And to be honest, that's where the real work was done. I did some other work for the Secretary General of NATO in Brussels, where he was worried about the decision process. And I remember I spent 2 weeks there in an ethnographic role. And going to his office afterwards and said, look, the way it works is everybody gets together in the formal meeting and they have a bitter row, yeah? And then they all go into the corridors and have coffee over 2 weeks and they sort the problem out. Then they come back to another meeting and resolve it. And this is a good plan, so don't disrupt it, it's working. You know, the human system has developed this mechanism, yeah, for conflict resolution, yeah, in terms of the way it works. I mean, it's slightly tangential to this, but when I was working on peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland back in the 70s, there was one approach which was get everybody in a room together and get them to talk for 2 days about how the Catholics and Protestants should love each other and not throw petrol bombs at each other. A process wonderfully satirized in episode 1 of series 2 of Derry Girls. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's on BBC iPlayer now. Sorry, no, it's Channel 4, not BBC. We took either 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant or 2 Protestants and 1 Catholic and dumped them into Latin America for 6 months, and we didn't talk about the Troubles. And that produced more sustainable change. And that was this process of working indirectly, yeah, as well as directly on the system. So that's slightly tangential to your question, but I think it's relevant. We change things by doing things, not by talking about how they will be. One of the things I teach executives, if you've got a negative rumor about you, don't go out and tell people it's wrong. Go out and do things which make it impossible for people to tell that story. That's far more effective.
So almost like it's, you know, the conversation is important, but the act of doing is actually more important.
Yeah, it is. And I think what you've got this process now, you see it with civil servants. They think if they've produced a plan, it's happened, whereas it hasn't. Yeah. And one of the things we developed a thing called vector theory of change, which is you don't say about what you'd like to be, but you show what's called an adjacent possible in complexity theory, a cluster of narrative near to where you are. And you say to people, what can we do tomorrow to create more like this and fewer like that? You engage everybody. If you say, how are we more customer focused? Everybody says, but we are. But if you say more of these, fewer of those, people can come up with real actions which make a difference. And of course, we can measure that in quantifiable terms. So vector measures start to replace outcome-based targets.
That's great. Thank you. And I know we, go ahead.
Dave, this is Graham Mitchellmore. I just want to ask you about the heuristics. You were talking about cognitive heuristics as a sort of a replacement for cognitive bias or a subgroup of cognitive bias. My concern is that some of those cognitive biases, as we would learn them, I suppose, are partly nature, partly nurture. And I think some of those cognitive biases are unintended consequences of perhaps our education or even intended consequences of our education. So I think in some ways the cognitive heuristics you seem to be talking about are the positive, can be used positively, but there's also there's sort of a residual cognitive biases that are perhaps don't fit into that category. Am I misunderstanding it, or?
There's a famous, I think it was Kierkegaard who said it. He said, nature may deal the cards, but nurture plays them. Right? Which is a good phrase. I think the reason is that Klein and myself and others don't like the word bias is these things have evolved over generations in humans. And generally evolution doesn't provide things which don't have utility. So inattentional blindness radically reduces the energy costs of making decisions. And most of the time it works because actually most of the time there aren't gorillas on X-rays. Yeah. And the fact that every now and then there are is something you live with. So I think there's that aspect to it. So the idea is we should stop talking about a bias because that indicates it's negative when it just is part of what we are. There are then in what are called entrainment patterns, which arise through education. And I think this is one of the problems. I wrote an article on ethics for ITEL the other days. Yeah. And I said, no systems engineer should be allowed any management authority in any system without a basic training in ethics, because they're making decisions which have ethical implications without an awareness of the issues. And I think that's an example of an entrain pattern we built in. I mean, these days, the mathematical skill you've got to be a good programmer is so high that you tend to see programmers moving towards the Asperger's end of the spectrum, which is a positive thing. I mean, I was the guy responsible for Google actively recruiting people with Asperger's syndrome. The trouble is that means you're not likely to see things, or you like things in a very structured way. So part of the problem for IT is, how do we handle people who can only describe things in very unstructured ways? Yeah? And how can we see what they really mean, rather than what we can prove that we think they meant?
Yeah, thanks for that. As I say, I just think that there's, you talk about the IT side, you've got an algorithm, and effectively it's a heuristic in a very basic way. And you can have algorithms that are completely designed, completely unintended consequences that are completely wrong.
Yeah, and that's
they are entrained, yeah.
And the way I describe it these days, and again, this may offend somebody, but is part of the problem we got is that a lot of the AI algorithms are developed by misogynist males on the west coast of America who took Ayn Rand seriously after puberty. Yeah? So the cultural bias of much AI is actually really scary with its implications for society.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Any more?
Time today. So I want to thank Dave for joining us and spending the hour with us and helping us think in a different way.
Real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, as they say.
Yeah, definitely. Pleasure to have you, Dave. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining. Great presentation. Lots to think about. Food for thought, for sure. Thank you, David, for your time.
Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.